Hey folks, welcome back to this in-depth demonology guide. We're going to take the lessons learned from our destruction guides and apply them to the previous demonology guide that I released, as it didn't help you guys as much as I would have liked. So let's get into it. Starting with the Covenants then, unfortunately unlike Destruction, Demonology is a lot more limited in its choices, both from a Mythic Plus perspective and from a rating perspective. On screen you'll see the two quote-unquote viable choices for Demonology, and we'll be discussing those in depth shortly. We've got Night Fae, where we use Dreamweaver, and we have Necrolord, where we use Marilith. I will, once I've discussed these two Covenants in depth, briefly touch on Kyrian and Venthyr, but they are from a perspective of niche picks, or you need the buff for that dungeon. So let's get into Night Fae to start with then. So delving into Night Fae and looking at the soulbind of choice. On screen you will see Dreamweaver is the selection, and the reason for this is because Dreamweaver gives us access to a few things within her soulbind that are really good for us this late into the expansion. Primarily that main bonus would be Field of Blossoms, in that we get 15% haste whenever we cast Soul Rot, and we stand in the pool that it drops at our feet. And as we go through the video, you will learn why that extra haste is so strong, as it combines with discussions within our talents and within our legendary choices, and just generally how the spec is designed. There is a case where you can, or you used to be able to use Naya, and as we go through this guide you'll find why Naya was more appropriate at the start of the expansion and has kind of tailed off as we've got this far in. So I will also discuss the Conduits that you see on screen as a section at the end, because Demonology, unlike Destruction where you kind of chop and change around things and you play with your Covenant specific conduit, Demonology doesn't. Demonology focuses very much on 4 conduits. The 3 potency conduits that I have selected at the moment are tier based, and once you get the 2 set you then adopt this particular setup rather than a previous one, but we will discuss that at the end once we've covered a Necrolord as well. So Night Fae's strength is that the moment there are any targets for you to cleave off, it becomes considerably stronger because of our legendary and how it interacts with cleave situations. So on a single target setting, you soul rot 1 target, you're going to get 5% haste and 5% crit for 8 seconds. Now that's nice. It's not huge, but it's nice. It starts becoming more noticeable when you consistently have 2 or 3 targets in a fight setting and you're actually getting that 15-20% extra haste and crit for 8 seconds every minute. Now, conversely, moving on to Necrolord, we have a very single target focused Covenant and Soulbind. The Soulbind that we'll be choosing is Plague Deviser Marilith because of his final trait, Kevin's Oozling, which means when we use our ability Decimating Bolt, we then summon an Oozling that applies a debuff to the target, which means they take 6% more damage from us. And that's about it. There's a few nice things within Plague Deviser Marilith's tree, like when you fleshcraft, you gain mastery from yourself, and you gain stats based on the corpses around you, which is a nice benefit, but it's primarily the mastery that you'll be using on yourself, and it kind of puts fleshcraft into a maintenance thing through the course of the rotation. Can be a little bit problematic in places, but this is a single target themed Covenant, and as a result there's only a few fights in a raiding setting where you'll be using it, or could use it, like Skolex for instance, really strong single target fight, or maybe Halondrus, because again there's no situation where you're cleaving off anything. You do, however, lose movement on Halondrus, so it's down to your own preference. But the main pushing power behind what makes Necrolord so strong single target is the combination of Decimating Bolt, Shard of Annihilation, and And there is another legendary as well that we'll be discussing at a later stage called Bale Spider's Burning Core. And this trifecta of factors means that you're buffing your demon bolts drastically. And to the point where, for those of you that have kind of been keeping an eye on Demonology Warlock through 9.2, you'll see, especially in the PvP circles, there was a point where your demon bolts were hitting for like 80, 90k and just one-shotting people out of nowhere because you're able to buff your demon bolts so much, especially once things get in within execute range. So you use Decimating Bolt on a target, it increases the damage, and then paired with Shard of Annihilation, you have this kind of execute situation where, as a target's health gets lower, every 45 seconds, your demon bolts are going to be hitting harder and harder and harder until they eventually cap out at some obscene numbers. Now, my personal recommendation would be to stay Night Fae, and that is because of the Fleshcraft versus Soul Shape debate, but we can get onto that as we move into the talents. Moving into the honourable mentions then, before we discuss the Conduits and finally move on to the talents. I did say that Kyrian and Venthyr were both dungeon picks, in that if you need the buff to complete the Mythic Plus dungeon, then you can swap to them. But for that reason, I won't show you the Soulbind paths, and this is primarily because of just how much weaker they are in comparison to Night Fae and Necrolord respectively. I did discuss in my Destruction Guide how strong Venthyr was in Impending Catastrophe, but unfortunately Impending Catastrophe doesn't play well with Demonology's current toolkit. We are spending too much time trying to get imps out, generating tyrants, and we get a lot more damage out of a faster playstyle. But if you need to play it, then I recommend playing Nadia, because she can give you that haste you need, and also crit and other stat amp. You could play Theater for his T, which is a 3% stat, and if you get something like haste or intellect, then that's really, really good. You can't say no to 3% intellect after all. But for Kyrian, my recommendation would be Mechanicos, because it lowers the cooldown of Scouring Tithe, which in turn means more shards over the course of a dungeon if you use it correctly, and you also get the additional crit as well, which would be really, really big if you use that leading into a Tyrant window where you're getting that 33% crit, or even more using the Soul Detritus Legendary. Now, on the left hand side of your screen are the potency conduits that we use: Born of Blood, Carnivorous Stalkers, Fell Commando, and Tyrant Soul. There are 4 there. The reason for that is because Carnivorous Stalkers and Fell Commando are interchangeable based on what tier set you have, or the amount of tier sets you have. The moment you have 2 pieces of your tier set, you're using Carnivorous Stalkers over Fell Commando at any given point. Conversely, on the right hand side of your screen, you have Fell Celerity, Demonic Momentum, Diabolic Bloodstone, and Condensed Animus Fear. These are 2 Endurance Conduits and 2 Finesse Conduits, as you can see. And it depends on what you favour within your Soulbinds. You'll see, going back to Necrolord for instance, if you want to scroll back slightly, you can see that in the middle, just underneath Carnivorous Stalkers, I have chosen to take an extra Finesse Conduit rather than an extra Endurance Conduit. This is because I do a lot of Mythic Plus, and occasionally my pet does bite the dirt a little bit more frequently than I'd like, or if I'm pugging, I have to quickly dismiss my pet, and having a shorter cooldown on Fell Domination so I can get those quick summons out, it means I don't feel as punished as much. But you could go with something like Condensed Animus Fear instead if you're worried about your defensive capabilities. So it's entirely up to you. Now, having discussed the conduits a little bit and kind of shown you which ones you need, we can move on to the talent section. Moving into the talents then, unlike Destruction, which was a lot more solidified in its choice of talents. Demonology is a lot more fluid, and it's noticeable as you get gear. What you're seeing on the screen now is the single target kind of raid build that you will see if you don't have any tier at all. Demonic Strength, Demonic Calling, Dark Pact, Summon Vile Fiend, Mortal Coil, Grimoire Felguard, and Demonic Consumption. Now, this is your no-tier single target piece. However, the moment you transition into having your 2-piece, you move out of Demonic Strength into Dreadlash. And this is because at that point with your third dog, your third Dreadstalker, Dreadlash starts becoming more viable, especially in a raiding setting when you remember that a lot of fights have cleave. Fights such as Skolex or Halondrus, you could probably still use Demonic Strength if you wanted to, but the recommendation is to move over to Dreadlash. Then, once you transition into your 4 set, you then move from Summon Vile Fiend into From the Shadows, as you'll see on screen now. And this is kind of then your default single target build. It's also a very, very good Mythic Plus build in that you're emphasizing a lot of AoE damage through your dogs. Now, the variant for Mythic Plus that you might see, and this kind of starts boiling down into your legendary choices, is swapping from Grimoire Felguard to Soul Conduit, which is now showing up as also highlighted on the screen for you. And the difference between this 45 or level 45 tier is how you want your damage to look over the course of a dungeon. It also kind of lends itself into legendary choices, which we'll discuss shortly. But Soul Conduit is a more consistent build AoE, because end of the day that is more shard generation over the course of the dungeon, because you're actually getting refunds from Hands of Gul'dan. And remember, with Born of Blood Conduit, every time we Hand of Gul'dan, we have a chance to spawn a Demonic Core proc, which is a Demon Bolt, which is more shards. So being able to refund shards back and spamming Hand of Gul'dan's back to back to back, there have been points in my own personal gameplay, for instance, where you end up with 2 or 3 Demonic Core procs for free, which can then immediately be fed into more Hand of Gul'dan's, which kind of lends itself quite well, especially when you're considering that in an AoE setting, you're going to be imploding those imps. Like once you start hitting 6, 9 imps, you're going to be imploding 2 targets plus. Conversely, Grimoire Felguard is still very much your burst. It's a 2-minute cooldown high burst, and if you're playing Orc or you're running a 2-minute trinket, you can macro all of that together so that on a 2-minute cycle you have this really strong burst of AoE. Because you've got to remember, Grimoire Felguard, the moment it summons, it's going to Fellstorm and it's going to do quite a lot of damage. And not only that, but it's also more health to put into your Demonic Tyrant and through Demonic Consumption. So with kind of these talents discussed and whatnot, let's go into the next section. Moving on to the gear section then. On screen you will see the raid list of gear that is considered our best in slot, and you'll notice that a lot of it, as I discussed in my previous Warlock guides, a lot of it comes from the final 3 bosses from the Sepulchre of the first ones, and this is because it is a higher item level, at 285 at Mythic level rather than 278. Now, with the Creation Catalyst being a thing, you'll see that the gloves, for instance, being Bindings of the Banished One, from the Jailer, you can keep those as they are from the Jailer, or alternatively you can use the Creation Catalyst to create 285 tier gloves. Now, why might you want to have tier gloves? The answer, simply put, is so that you can put Unity, or potentially Implosion, which is a legendary we'll be discussing shortly, onto your helm. And the reason for this is because, 1, rather than being 278 helm from Anduin, it will be a 291 helm, which means more intellect, more stats and things like that. It also guarantees you a gem slot, which means you're not having to hope that a tier will roll a gem slot for you. That's also an interesting thing about the Creation Catalyst as well. If you roll a piece of gear, say from Mythic Plus, and it's the helm from Plaguefall, for instance, and it has a socket on it, if you take that to the Creation Catalyst, it will keep its helm. So looking at some of the things from the dungeon list, transitioning that across in terms of tier gear is good, but remember, these lists will change depending on what gear has and hasn't dropped for you. For instance, I don't have the weapon from Halls of Atonement, I don't have the staff, unfortunately, so instead, because I have the one from the other side that drops from the Mana Storms instead, some of my other gear has to move around, but we'll briefly discuss that when we get to the stats section. The main focus of this section with gear will be discussing the trinkets. So with that, let's get into them. Starting with the dungeon-based trinket, and arguably the strongest ones out of our selection, you have Soul-Letting Ruby, Unbound Changeling, Infinitely Divisible Ooze, Inscrutable Quantum Device, also referred to as IQD, and you have Solaria's Signature Technique. Now, the ones across the top of the screen that you can see are the stronger ones. Generally, for Demonology, you're going to be wanting to be running Soul-Letting Ruby and Infinitely Divisible Ooze as your go-to raiding trinkets. The reason for this is Soul-Letting Ruby on a 2-minute cooldown, as I previously mentioned in the Talons section, can be macroed in with Grimoire Felguard, and you can get a free a crit amp as you go through the fight for a period of time. The only drawback to Soul-Letting Ruby is it takes time for the buff to get to you, which is why it's quite good to use it before you go into your Tyrant window and use it within your Grimoire window, because you're going to use Grimoire first as we get into the rotational section, and then you're going to have a few seconds before you get your Tyrant. And remember, your pets do dynamically adjust with you, so you want that crit for when your Tyrant's out. Unbound Changeling and Infinitely Divisible Ooze are both passives, which are really, really good because we're kind of moved away from the whole double on use era of WoW. But Infinitely Divisible Ooze pulls ahead because the frothing pustule that the trinket summons benefits from our mastery, and on top of that also feeds into demonic consumption, believe it or not, because you will take a portion of its health into your Tyrant windows when you have it up. The damage it does as well over the course of a fight, and even over the course of a dungeon, is nothing to be sniffed at. It will be about 4% of your total damage across an entire fight, and that is, or at least for me, is quite a lot for a trinket. Changeling does have its use if you just want to play with the extra stat, but remember, it is proc based, so there may be some pulls where you get it more often than others, and generally speaking, that comes more into play when you're doing Mythic Plus and you want the extra haste or the extra crit or whatever stat sims the best for you at the time in order to help amplify any AoE damage you do. Which kind of moves us on to the two trinkets below. IQD, which is a 3-minute cooldown trinket, and Solaria's Secret Technique. Now, Solaria's Secret Technique is kind of used if you want to guarantee a stat of something. So, as you can see, it provides less stat overall compared to Unbound Changeling. Unbound Changeling will proc for 502 at 268 item level, whereas Solaria's Secret Technique at 262 only grants 106 of a highest stat, and it requires you to put that onto somebody else. So if you're communicating with your group and you need haste, and you know that the Holy Paladin in your group is stacking haste out of the rear, then you can put Solaria's on him. You get 106 haste, and he gets 17 extra haste, or she gets haste, which means that you can guarantee that extra stat amp over the course of a dungeon. And sometimes, especially if you go back to my destruction guide, you'll see that there are cases where you might actually want to run two passives. So you might want to run Solaria's Secret Technique and Infinitely Divisible Ooze, or Changeling if you just want lots of extra stat for whatever reason. Now, IQD makes an appearance and will take over from the likes of Soul-Letting Ruby if you're running certain legendaries where it means that you're not quite lining your tyrants up. Because once we get into the legendary section, you'll realise that there's two ways to play, essentially. And those two ways to play dictate which of these two trinkets you have. You can either have your full 90-second Tyrant, at which point you're using IQD on every second Tyrant because it lines up perfectly, at which point you just macro IQD into your Tyrant and Bob's your uncle. Alternatively, you can have your 1 minute Tyrant and then Soul Letting Ruby works perfectly with it, because then again it's every other Tyrant. So you can kind of see where the similarities in with that trinket. Moving into the raid trinkets though, you then have access to the likes of First Sigil or the Elegy of the Eternals trinket, or Elegy. Don't know how to pronounce that one, but either way, Elegy of the Eternals is much like Slayer's Secret Technique in that it gives a passive stat, but unlike you having to select a target, it will actually just give anyone in your group of the same covenant a stat, and it will kind of cleave that stat onto you or anybody else. So you weep before the Eternals, dedicating yourself to their service, gain 115 of your highest secondary stat and grant 10% of this bonus to any party member who also serves your covenant. That's the tooltip. And at 265, it gives 111 or 115, sorry, of your highest stat. So it's a nice passive. You then also have the First Sigil, which is essentially a 5-minute version of IQD, and it gives a whopping amount of versatility, like a huge amount of versatility. The 265 version gives 1242 versatility for 20 seconds, and it also gives you access to your Covenant ability. And I don't mean your spell ability, your damaging ability, but your utility one. So the tooltip you see on the screen gives you access to Door of Shadows, so it resets the cooldown on it, giving you a free charge. This is really, really good for fights like Desorge the Fallen Oracle on Mythic when you need a get out of jail free card. Same with resetting the cooldown on Soul Shape, it gives you that extra mobility. And you can time it that you can use it at the start of the fight and at the point where you need it going into phase 3 on Desorge. Something I'll be discussing in a raid guide down the road. But you don't necessarily need to worry about the raid trinkets. They are nice to have, but the dungeon trinkets are far more accessible, as even just getting them to 272 through Valor and farming, and they will perform better. Like, your two best raiding trinkets will be Soul Letting Ruby and Infinitely Divisible Ooze. But with trinkets out of the way now, let's get into the Legendries and delve deeper into the playstyle changes that occur. Moving into the Legendries then, as alluded to, for raiding, depending on the Covenant, depends on which of these two Legendaries you're going to pick. So on the left hand side of your screen above me, you have Wilfred's Sigil of Superior Summoning. This is the Legendary responsible for getting our Tyrant to roughly a minute 5, and having it line up with every Soul Rot, and generally having a quicker Tyrant build. Alternatively, on the right hand side of the screen, if you're playing Necrolord, you will see Bale Spider's Burning Core, and this is the legendary I was discussing when I was talking about the trifecta that would give Necrolords their execute damage and gives huge single target damage as you go through the course of a fight. Because if you read the tooltip, Shadow Bolt increases the damage of your Demon Bolt by 15%, stacking up to 4 times, lasts 20 seconds. And this, paired with Decimating Bolt's baseline amplification of Demon Bolt based on a health percentage, and then Shard of Annihilation's additional critical strike and crit damage buff to Demon Bolt, you can see why Bale Spider's Burning Core becomes so powerful. Now, you could, if you were playing Necrolord, still play with Wilfred's, but you would be handicapping yourself slightly. Wilfred's strength lies in being able to spend as many shards as possible in order to reduce your Tyrant down, so that you end up in a situation where you are playing a 1 minute-ish Tyrant, which lines up well with every Soul Rot and Decaying Soul Satchel, and the use of a 2-minute trinket like Soul-Letting Ruby, for instance. Now, in this particular case, Necrolord would favour IQD, and as previously mentioned, Nightfey prefers Soul-Letting Ruby, and this is kind of where you end up in that situation. Moving into Mythic Plus, however, we have a few more options open up, in that Balespider's Burning Core is removed from the situation because, let's face it, Mythic Plus is also about trash and cleave, therefore AoE, and unfortunately it doesn't scale very well. It might be good in niche situations for like Theatre of Pain during a Tyrannical week, for instance, where it's more of a boss rush, but the options alluded to us are Implosive Potential and Grim Inquisitor's Dread Calling. Wilfred's remains, because, you know, faster tyrants. Implosive Potential and Grim Inquisitors are both very, very good at what they do. Starting with Grim Inquisitors then. Each soul shard spent on Hand of Gul'dan increases the damage of your next Dread Callers by 4%. This is a very strong legendary once you get the 2 set, and if you go to the Warlock Discords or you ask around, generally speaking, Grim Inquisitors is kind of like the go-to once you have your 2 set. And the reason for this is because you're not just buffing the 2 dogs that you summon baseline, you're also buffing the dog that you summon through your tier set, which means that this legendary gets essentially 50% stronger once you get that set bonus, and it stacks up. This buff stacks up to 30 times. So you spend 30 shards and you're going to have 120% more damage on your next Dreadstalkers. You don't need to hold it up to 30, but there will be situations where you might end up getting to that, especially if you're like oozing shards, which is where you start getting that emphasis on the Soul Conduit build. And the good thing about Grim Inquisitors is because it's focusing the damage into your Dreadstalkers, you're not very reliant on the tank. This tank reliance that specs like Destruction suffer from, Demonology doesn't really have, because a lot of it's movable damage, like your imps will chase a target to try and cast if they have to, or you'll be imploding them so they won't need to. Your Dreadstalkers will chase something. So if the tank is running around, they chase, and they still have a chance using Carnivorous Stalkers and Dreadlash to cleave bite everything anyway. So they can keep up, which is good. Implosive Potential also prefers the Soul Conduit build, but Implosion grants haste while you have this legendary equipped. And it grants 1% haste for 12 seconds for every imp you explode, but if you hit 3 or more targets, you gain 5% haste per imp instead. This was recently capped out so that it could only provide you with 15 imps worth, which is 75% haste, and although that might seem like a problem, because prior to this we were able to get to like 300% haste, as I discussed in my previous demo video, this is still a lot of haste over the course of a dungeon. You are frequently getting 30-40% haste from pack to pack because you're imploding 6 imps through your rotation, sometimes 9, depending on how many you get through your procs, and that is converting into 5% haste per imp. That extra haste that you get is then being fed into your Carnivorous Stalkers, your Felguard, your Tyrant when it's up, and talking about how the rotation changes based on the legendary you use, this was the legendary I was talking about with Implosive Potential. Because Implosive Potential, what you want to do, especially with boss fights, once you start getting past Mythic Plus level 10, and you meet the Affix encrypted, at the start of boss encounters, you are going to have 4 targets present before one of those relics dies, turning into either Woe, or the Drift, or Vi, sorry. Woe and the Drifter are the same thing. But because you have those 4 targets there, Decaying Soul Satchel, if you use Soul Rot, is going to give you 20% haste and 20% crit, and if you implode your imps after a Tyrant, you also get the 5% haste for your Tyrant per imp rather than 1%, which is huge and means that you can still get to the likes of 200% haste with your Bloodlust and everything else into this Tyrant window, and your Tyrant is going to burn everything. Because your Tyrant goes from being a slow casting juggernaut to essentially a 50 gauge machine gun. Just sending 50 cals downrange. And as a result, you can have some incredible boss burst damage. The problem with that is it takes a little bit of practice and also a little bit of coordination with your group. Because if you have someone that just goes, right, I am going to, let's say, Monk, really good example here. If you have a Monk Touch of Death to guarantee that it goes down in time, you are immediately handicapped when it comes to implosive potential because you've now only got 2 mobs, which means that Soul Rot and Implosion are going to give you less value, which is where which is the drawback of implosive potential. So my recommendation would be to use implosive potential in group coordinated or group based content where you can coordinate if you're of a voice, whether it's a guild run or with a couple of friends. Really good fun. Grim Inquisitors is going to be your kind of default pug world battery pack, essentially, where it'll amplify your damage. It's nothing too flashy, you're not going to see anything huge from it, but at the end of the dungeon you'll look and your dogs will have done some work. They'll be like 2-3 million damage ahead of your next ability. Wilfred's you can also use, but Wilfred's has a much softer tank dependence than, say, Implosion, but it still has more of a tank dependency than Grim Inquisitors, because indirectly you want to be in combat as much as possible in order to maximize Wilfred's benefit, because it is a cooldown reduction on your Tyrant when you're spending shards, which means you want to be spending shards as much as possible to get as many Tyrants in. If you pull, and Implosion kind of suffers from this same problem as well, because you want to be taking imps from pack to pack to implode, you need quite an aggressive tank. Now, I personally don't have that problem. My tank for my group coordination stuff is really aggressive, which is great, but that has its own problems in terms of positioning and being aware of how he pulls. I have suffered equally when I have pugged and I've had tanks that have been very, very slow or very, very tentative. Now, whether they're learning or they're not sure on how much they can survive, that's fine. But in those situations, that's where Grim Inquisitor is strong, because you're like, well, this buff doesn't expire. I don't care if it takes you 5 seconds to get to the next pack or 15 seconds to get to the next pack. Whereas both Implosive Potential and Tyrant and Wilfred's both do suffer from that. Now we've discussed the Legendries though, and I've kind of given you a breadth of how these look. Let's go on to the rotation, and then finally a couple of tips and tricks to round this video off, because I appreciate it's been a long one. Onto the rotation then. On the screen you are going to see the single target opener typed out for you, so you can pause this, read it, practice it, do whatever you want with it, screenshot it, don't mind. And the premise of this is, as you precast Demon Bolt, roughly 3 seconds before the timer, so that it has the travel time and hit, you're going to have 5 shards as soon as the boss is pulled, essentially. And that means you can cast Grimoire Felguard. Now, if you don't have Foresight and you're still running Summon Vile Fiend, you're also going to follow that up with a Summon Vile Fiend and a Shadow Bolt. You're then going to cast Shadow Bolt again because you're building back up to 5 shards. You're then going to cast Call Dreadstalkers. Hopefully you're going to have a Demonic Calling proc, which means that your Dreadstalkers is free, or you're going to have a Demonic Core proc, because you're going to cast Dreadstalkers, build back up to 5 shards, so either casting Shadow Bolt twice or the Demon Bolt, cast Hand of Gul'dan, that brings you down to 2 shards, Shadow Bolt, that's your 3 shards, you're then going to Hand of Gul'dan, that brings you to 0 shards. Then you're going to cast your Demonic Tyrant. Now the priority here, and why it's in asterisks and an exclamation mark, is you need to extend your prior demons. Like, it does, like if you only have 4 seconds left on dogs and you don't have that 3 shards for the Hand of Gul'dan, you just spend your Hand of Gul'dan, your 2 shards, and get your Tyrant out, because you need to extend both Grimoire Felguard, your Dreadstalkers, and if talented, Summon Vile Fiend. Once you've cast your Demonic Tyrant and extended everything, you're then going to cast Soul Rot, give you your haste amp. Hand of Gul'dan, Shadow Belt, Hand of Gul'dan, and that brings you back down to 0. Hopefully you'll have a few demonic core procs, so at this point it becomes a maintenance game up until your next Tyrant window, where you're then playing around casting Dreadstalkers on cooldown, making sure that you don't cap out on 5 shards, and you're rotating through your Hand of Gul'dans, you're using your demonic core procs rather than just sat at 4, and you're just cycling through it. Once you've gotten to the motion of playing through your spec, Demonology is quite relaxed if you just treat it like a priority system of Dreadstalkers, not capping shards, fill with demonic core or shadow bolts as required. Because remember, if you have something like Soul Conduit, you might Hand of Gul'dan, and rather than from 5 shards, and rather than ending up at 2 shards, you might end up at 3 shards or even 4 shards, because you've just had 2 shards refunded to you, at which point you can spam into your Hand of Gul'dans. Now, what you're about to watch is a highlight video as we discuss Implosion, and this highlight video is from a 21 The Other Side that I did last week during a segment storming week. And although Ardenweald DOS is traditionally a high destruction, like you'll see high-end streamers and YouTubers playing as destruction in this because it's a lot flashier, you can do larger pulls, Demonology still holds its own. So I'd like you to watch the video. Keep in mind my haste, because I am using the Implosive Legendary. So you will see my haste bounce around, and it's just underneath to the left of my nameplate. And also watch the DPS as well, because we're in a group where I'm with a 4-set hunter. I obviously have 4-set, and although the monk hadn't quite acquired his 4-set by this point, at least I don't think he had, it was still putting up a good fight, and it was overall a much more even damage spread. Nowhere near as flashy as Destruction, but still worth a good watch. So, without any further delay, I'll let you guys watch it, and I'll catch you afterwards. Having watched that little highlight, hopefully you guys can see kind of the strength of Implosion and Demonology's kind of cleave AoE, and not necessarily relying on where the tank's moving. Ideal during weeks like Sanguine, when the tanks need to be moving around and can't necessarily just be static the entire time. A few little things about the highlight before we talk about what's on the screen now. I didn't actually use my racial or my trinket, so I was rather bad in that sense. I could have gained a lot of crit had I used my soul lettering rupee through that. As you could see on my UI, it was available for use, and because I didn't use it, I also didn't use my racial either, because they're macro together and are usually macroed to Grimoire Felguard, so if I'm not using the talent, I sometimes forget to use it. But as with what's on the screen now then, talking about Implosion and kind of our AoE cleave burst damage. So with 2 or more stacks of Demonic Core, you're going to build to 5 shards, cast Hand of Gul'dan, and then burning your Demonic Core proc, you're going to build to 4 with Demon Bolt, Hand of Gul'dan, then 3, Hand of Gul'dan. You're then going to cast another spell. Ideally, it's going to be your Dreadstalkers, because remember, Dreadstalkers, once you have From the Shadows, is also going to apply a debuff to the target that increases the Shadow Flame damage that the targets take, and this cleaves with Dreadlash. And Implosion is Shadow Flame damage. So ideally, you're going to be casting Dreadstalkers, but sometimes it'll have to be a Shadow Bolt or something else. But once all those imps have spawned, you're then going to cast Implosion and laugh as your DPS skyrockets on a big pack. Because it will. There's a Spires of Ascension clip that I do have somewhere where I hit something like 104k DPS during an Implosion window. But that is with a Kyrian Spear, so I didn't think that was appropriate for this particular guide. I thought this Arden Wield clip was more appropriate. But with 1 or 0 stacks of Demonic Core, unfortunately you skip the building to 4-bit. So you're going to build to 5, Hand of Gul'dan, build to 3 with your Demonic Core, Hand of Gul'dan, cast another spell, and then implode. And as I said, enjoy spiking up in the damage meters. This is also interesting if you're going from a pack to pack, because you can... If you have this mostly set up and your imps still have a reasonable amount of time remaining, if you have that aggressive tank, you can go into the next pack with 8 imps or something and immediately implode for like 80k, which is quite funny, and because it's pet damage, you don't often pull threat, so that's something to consider. Now, finally, to wrap this up, we're going to briefly talk about tips and tricks on what you can do to make healers like you all the more when we don't necessarily have the utility that comes with being something like Destruction, for those of you that like that part in the other guide. On to the tips and tricks then, and to wrap this video up. Unfortunately, Demonology is very limited in what its pet can bring. Our Felguard has Axe Toss, which is primarily a stun, but in cases where a mob is immune to stun, will act as an interrupt. If this is a coordinated group setting, that's fantastic. If you can put a mob onto DR or stun DR, so it is essentially quote-unquote immune, you then have a kick. But in a pug setting, your kick is problematic at best. It's on a 30-second cooldown, so it's the longest kick in the game. But also, if you want a mob to come in, like Halls of Atonement for instance, it's not going to, I'm afraid. You're going to stun it, and then once the stun is over, it's then going to be just stood there, free casting again. This is one of those things where you can use your other class utility to try and position the mob in a way that it forces itself into the pack. So, for instance, using Mortal Coil, something that I discussed in my Destruction tips and tricks, you can use it to move a mob into a pack once it's stunned, so it doesn't have time to cast. The other way to do it as well is if you do Axe Toss a target and you have like a few Demonic Core procs, So you can cast while moving and position yourself closer to the mob so that when it then comes out of its next cast, if you then use your Mortal Coil as a form of interrupt, say 2 seconds into the cast bar, you're affording your group time to react. Especially if it's a pug and you know you've just watched the hunter or the mage kick something else, because their kick's on a 24-second cooldown. So you have that option available to you. The big thing that Demonology Warlocks bring to the table, especially in dungeons where we are particularly strong, is the use of Banish. Banish works on demons, aberrations, or elementals, which means in situations like Plaguefall, for instance, you can help CC the large smorgasbord adds that are summoned by Grolbog at the very, very start of the dungeon. This means that with a hunter and a monk, or a druid, for instance, you can, on tyrannical weeks, basically hold out the 3 adds that will spawn. The smaller ones need to be dealt with, but the large ones that are usually a problem you can keep out indefinitely. Also, if you plan on using the red slimes in Plaguefall, another good example of this, you can pre-banish red slime adds, the ones that give us a lot of haste when we have the Necrolord buff, or just by standing in its pool. By banishing it, you prevent people from accidentally AoEing it, or it being pulled out of position. A good example of this is Icus, the second boss within Plaguefall. There is a pack that is usually taken. It is purple slime, humanoid caster, and a red slime. Now, they obviously need to be pulled away from the boss platform, otherwise the boss is going to land on the party and things are going to get messy. You can banish, if you're fast enough, the red add in place so that the other 2 mobs can be pulled away, dealt with. You can then unbanish, and during the boss's next cycle, kill the red slime in advance. And doing this helps smooth everything, and also make sure that the red slime is where you want it to be, because there's nothing worse than having the red slime die somewhere and the buff actually be completely useless, because you can't do anything about it. Other things that you bring to the table as well are things like your curses, making full use of Curse of Weakness and Curse of Exhaustion, and Curse of Tongues in large caster situations, because we don't necessarily have something like Impending Catastrophe to work to our favour like Destruction does. So making sure that those are bound and something that you're comfortable with will definitely help you, especially when it comes to certain packs. So Curse of Weakness, for instance, really, really good in parts of Sanguine when there's a lot of melee mobs. Alternatively, Curse of Tongues is great just after the first boss in Sanguine when you've got to deal with that room full of casters. Because, let's face it, we don't have a lot of kicks, so unless you've got AoE stuns like Leg Sweep or Shadow Fury, or an AoE Fear, God forbid, that a priest might use to get those kicks in, or AoE Silence, you're going to want to try and slow those cast times down, especially the Curse of Suppressions, because those are going to hurt the priest, or the healer, sorry, if they're silenced, especially during fortified weeks when those mobs do a lot of damage themselves anyway. Another thing, talking about that particular pack, is Curse of Suppression can be unending resolved, which means that you can just immune it if it's targeting you, and if you're coordinated with your team, you can tell them to not kick. Don't kick X, it's targeting me, I will immune it. And that's something that's going to make the group run a lot easier, because they don't have to worry and panic or kicks get fluffed. In the same vein on Unending Resolve, and something that may or may not be known to you guys, for Tazavesh Streets, and this is kind of my last point of note, the Peacekeepers be in melee range. Unending Resolve will not immune you to their silence when they charge you. I don't know if it's a bug. I've yet to have confirmation to say otherwise, but it is something that is problematic. Like, I've stood at range to try and cast my Hand of Guldans, my Dreadstalkers or whatever, used Unending Resolve thinking, oh, it's like, you know, I can immune Quaking, or I can immune Curse Suppression. And unfortunately, I've still been silenced. And I'm there just with, like, However, interesting thing, if you do have a Paladin on hand, Bop works, because it seems to be a physical silence. So, don't know what that was about. Could have been a bug, who knows. But anyway, that kind of wraps up my tips and tricks with terms of like utility and what Demonology can bring to the table, aside from its raw damage. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's helped more than my previous video did. If you have any comments, please do comment below, and if you've liked the video, feel free to give me a subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one, folks. Take it easy and have a good one.